Hello and welcome to the Bible in a Year podcast, a new resource from Enter the Bible. In this podcast, we're journeying through the books of the Bible, discovering more about Scripture and how it shapes our lives today. And I'm Kristofer Phan Coffman.
And I am Katie Langston, and today we are joined by a very special guest, someone who is often a co-host, so this is fun to have the shoe on the other foot? Does that make sense as a saying?
Yeah.
We're joined by...
It's a lot more work this way.
Yeah, right. I just have to show up and ask questions. But yes, we're joined by Kathryn Schifferdecker. She is professor of Old Testament at Luther Seminary. And, welcome, Kathryn. So glad to have you with us.
Thanks for asking me.
Yeah. Well, today we are going through the Book of Leviticus, which I have to say has stalled, I think, many a Bible reader who said, I'm going to get through the whole thing. And you get a few chapters into Leviticus and you're like, I think I'm out on this. So maybe there are ways to make Leviticus fun. We'll start maybe just give us a summary or an outline of this book. What's going on? I know whenever I read it, I'm like, there's a lot of rules in here that I don't think I have to follow anymore. It's confusing. So what's going on in there?
Yeah. One of my favorite commentators on Leviticus, not that it's a big field to choose from, but a guy named Samuel Ballantyne talks about Leviticus as the most neglected of all the neglected biblical books. And there's good reason for it. Like you said, Katie, people who have the best intentions of reading the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, lots of good intentions have been wrecked on the shoals of Leviticus, right? It's just, it's a tedious read for modern folks. For sure. The outline is something so chapters 1 through 7 are really detailed instructions about what sacrifices to bring and how to sacrifice the animals that are sacrificed, and just, really arcane details in chapters 1 through 7. Chapters 8 through 10 is a kind of narrative, still a lot of legal stuff, describing the ordination of Aaron as the high priest and his sons as priests. Chapters 11 through 16 are lots of laws about, again, seemingly arcane things like skin disease. There's untold numbers of verses dedicated to the discussion of various skin diseases and how you deal with them. Food, animals that can be eaten and animals that can't be eaten, so clean and unclean animals. I can talk more about that later. And then chapter 17, scholars discern a somewhat different emphasis in chapter 17 through 26 and possibly 27, the last chapter. And scholars refer to this as the Holiness Code. So the emphasis there in these chapters seems to be not so much about instructions to the priests on how to do various ritual things, but really instructions to the whole people on how to live as a holy people. And that holiness touches every aspect of life in this part of Leviticus. So it's certainly about worship, and sacrifices, but it's also about what you eat, and it's about sexual relationships, and it's about how you treat others in the marketplace, and how you treat the land, and how you treat servants or slaves, how you harvest your land. There's rules here that may be somewhat easier to understand about how to live as a holy people. And the whole emphasis is how to live in such a way that a holy God can dwell with a holy people. So that's Leviticus's main concern.
And so even though this is a neglected book, of course, it's one of the big five. It's part of the third book in the Pentateuch that we sometimes call it, or the Torah.
Right.
And you touched on this a little bit when you're talking about the outline of the book. But what's the message of it? How would you sum that up in the context of, again, knowing that it's part of this very essential part of Scripture?
Yeah, I think I would probably quote Leviticus itself to sum up the message. 19:2, and in several other places in Leviticus, God says to Israel, "You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." That really, I think, is a good summary of the message of Leviticus. So let me put it a little bit in its narrative context. So Leviticus, of course, comes right after Exodus. And so the people are still at Mount Sinai. So they've received the 10 Commandments. They've come out of slavery in Egypt. They've crossed the Red Sea. All the stories in Exodus about the manna and the golden calf. And they're at Mount Sinai. They're given the 10 Commandments. And then they're given instructions for building the tabernacle, which is this kind of portable Mount Sinai, the tent of meeting, it's sometimes called. The tabernacle is like a movable temple, literally a tent that contains the Ark of the Covenant, and where this is where sacrifices are made. God has promised to dwell with the people in that sanctuary, in the tabernacle. But the problem is God is holy, right? And God cannot abide sin. I'll talk more about that later. So Leviticus addresses the problem of how can a holy God dwell in the midst of a people who are prone to sin. And so all these laws about sacrifices, about clean and unclean animals, about skin disease, about, how to conduct your daily activities, they're all aimed at having the people live holy lives, having the people be a holy people so that God can dwell amongst them and not destroy them, right? So that's what Leviticus is concerned with.
Yeah, what kind of a book is this? Like, it's not a lot of stories. What are we looking at?
Yeah. It's really a book of law.
Mm-hmm.
And ritual, which is related, but maybe not quite the same thing, which is why modern people, including me, sometimes often find it pretty tedious. We're used to reading stories, right? Or maybe, letters like the epistles. We're not used to reading law and ritual. And so that's why one of my students early on in my teaching career at Luther, I had to sign the Book of Leviticus as part of the class. And she said, I never realized I could fall asleep on a treadmill until I was walking on a treadmill trying to read the Book of Leviticus. Right?
Oh, no.
And you can understand why, right? It's kind of it's very detailed in a way that doesn't seem all that pertinent to our lives. And so you can see why people have trouble reading it. So it's it's a book of law. It's a book of ritual. So to read it, I guess I would say a study Bible is really important.
Yeah, okay.
To understand some of the details. Maybe don't start at the very beginning. Maybe skip around a little bit to see, maybe skip over the details about sacrifices. Maybe read a commentary alongside it. I mentioned Samuel Ballantyne. He's written a really lovely commentary on Leviticus, building on the work of Jacob Milgrom. Jacob Milgrom was the 20th and 21st century expert on Leviticus. He wrote a 3-volume commentary on the book. I wouldn't necessarily recommend, you could use that as a reference work, but I think Ballantyne's book is more approachable. Or some works by Mary Douglas, who is actually not a Bible scholar per se, but an anthropologist. Mary Douglas wrote a lovely book called Leviticus as Literature, and she studies Leviticus through an anthropological lens and really comes up with some really interesting insights into the book. So I would say Leviticus, maybe more than any other biblical book, I would recommend having a companion to read it with, like a scholarly work to help understand what it's about.
Another scholar who is in conversation with Mary Douglas is Jonathan Klawans, Klawans. And it's an interesting, you can take this opportunity when you think about getting into the Bible to read the book and read a commentator, and then read a commentator who's in conversation with that commentator can help open up what might be a book that you find tedious at first as you see these different interpretations. That can be another way to get into it. And another way to get into the book of Leviticus is Bible Bingo, which is one of our features here on the Bible in a Year podcast. And what we do with this is we ask our guests to come up with 5 concepts that as they read through Leviticus, they're on the lookout for. And so Kathryn has already provided these to us, and I'm going to run through them, and she's going to tell us why they're important. And so we'll start with holiness.
Yeah, I think I've probably talked about holiness enough, but it's just such an overwhelming theme in the book of Leviticus. So, you can talk about various characteristics of God throughout the Bible, right? God is relational, God is faithful, God is merciful, God is just. If the writers of Leviticus had to choose one characteristic of God that is most important, it would definitely be holiness. God is holy. And so it's just kind of an overriding concern of the writers. And the writers, by the way, are almost everybody agrees, really everybody agrees, probably from the priestly class. So they're priests writing about priestly concerns of holiness. Yeah.
What does
Which
holiness
I think
mean?
plays into bingo. Oh, go for it, Katie.
I'm sorry. This is not
What does
rapid
holiness
succession.
mean?
But what
that's
does
a good
holiness
question. Holiness is certainly about living justly, living ethically, living with integrity. It's also, though, a friend of mine talks about holiness as being weird, maybe in the best possible sense of that word. In other words, not being like the people around you, not giving in to the temptations of that the people around you do. So living apart, living in an alternative way that acknowledges God's holiness and seeks to emulate that in your own life. I kind of like that description, being weird or being set apart. Maybe that's a more understandable way of talking about it. Because over and over again in Leviticus, God says to the people, don't live like the other nations around you. You should live differently. You should live as a reflection of, really as image of God, to go back to Genesis 1, to live in such a way that God is reflected in your life and you obey God's commands.
Wonderful. Tell us about ritual.
Yeah, so ritual, I mentioned earlier, I like the definition that I've read, that ritual is kind of embodied theology. So I think we as modern people sometimes think we don't have rituals, or at least those of us who are Protestant or evangelical may not think we have rituals, but think about, tailgating at a football game, right? There are certain dishes that you make. There are certain things you wear. I mean, really, athletic games are filled with rituals, right? Or Thanksgiving dinner, right? There are certain dishes that you always prepare, and you may even put them in the same, serving bowls every year, right? You take down the big tray for the turkey only at Thanksgiving, right? That's a kind of ritual. And certainly in church, we have rituals like baptism, like Holy Communion, standing for the gospel reading, kneeling to do confession of sins. There's, I could go on and on, but ritual really is kind of living out your theology in an embodied way, right? Putting your body where your mouth is, so to speak, so that you're living out what you say you believe. So Leviticus is full of rituals, right? This is how you sacrifice. This is what you do with the fat of the animal. This is what you don't do. This is how you treat your neighbor. And the hard thing about Leviticus is Leviticus itself doesn't give the reason for why you're doing that. And so you have to sometimes infer what the reason is underneath the rituals, except again for that important verse, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. That's the reason given for all of the rituals, really, in Leviticus.
As somebody who lives with a 2-year-old at home, my life is full of rituals that ensure the proper way that things are done.
Yeah.
And peace is maintained in the house. Rituals for washing hands and going to bed and getting up and all these things. So
that's a great example. Yeah.
Appreciate Leviticus.
Yeah, there are ways in which rituals provide boundaries for our lives so that chaos doesn't ensue, right?
Exactly.
I mean, that's really, that's the reason for those kind of boundaries and rituals. Yeah.
So number 3 seems a little bit like a zag, but I'm interested to hear where you go with this. Land.
Yeah, I haven't mentioned this yet, but Leviticus is a very kind of material book, right? It's concerned with soil and water and flesh, the flesh of animals and the flesh of human beings, and, skin disease. It's just one example of that. And so one of these big concerns is land. Like, how do you treat the land? This is especially true in Leviticus 25, which is one of my favorite probably definitely my favorite chapter in Leviticus. So Leviticus 25 is about the Jubilee year. So every 7 times 7 years, a Jubilee is declared, and people go home to their original land, even if they've had to sell that land. They get it back in the Jubilee year. Slaves are released and debts are forgiven. And those who can't redeem themselves, can't buy themselves out of debt, their redeemer, their goel, has to do that for them. So their next of kin does that. So it's just this beautiful vision of every 50 years, the slate is wiped clean and you get to start over again. And no one becomes too rich for too long, and no one becomes poor for forever. And in Leviticus 25, God says, "The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine, says the Lord. With me you are but sojourners and travelers." So it's just a really important statement that I think we need to keep in mind, again, in this age when we know that human-induced climate change is threatening the whole creation. The land is not ours. The land is God's. And we are given it only for a short time to take care of it and to treat the land in such a way that life will continue and that life will flourish. I could say a lot more about that, but that's probably enough for now.
Wonderful. Number 4, Sabbath.
Yeah, I haven't mentioned this yet, but Sabbath is a huge concept in Leviticus. The same writers who are responsible for Leviticus are probably the same ones that are responsible for Genesis 1 in the beginning of chapter 2, the 7 days of creation, where the 7th day is the Sabbath. These priestly writers pick up that theme in Exodus, but also in Leviticus. And there's this pattern of 7 throughout the book of Leviticus. The first 7 chapters are about sacrifices. The ordination is 7 days long. And that pattern is important because it's a reference, kind of an oblique reference to the Sabbath day, which is the 7th day, right? Every 7th day you rest. And even more importantly, everybody under your authority rests. Every 7th year, the land rests, Exodus says. Every 7 times 7 years is the Jubilee, where, again, debts are forgiven and people get their land back. So Sabbath, this concept of a regular time of rest, a regular time of, trusting God to provide, is central to the priestly worldview and to the book of Leviticus. So Sabbath is about rest. Sabbath is about justice, right? That, again, the Jubilee where everybody's debt is forgiven. Sabbath is about trust, faith in God, that God will provide, that we don't have to work 24/7, that God will provide.
Wonderful. And that leads us right into number 5, life.
Yeah, so this probably would strike our listeners as kind of weird, like a book that spends the first 7 chapters talking about sacrificing animals. Is maybe not a book about life, but it actually is. And again, this is where scholars like Jacob Milgram and Mary Douglas and Sam Ballantyne have taught me. If you dig below the surface in Leviticus, you see that in Leviticus, there's a profound respect for life, the life of human beings and the life of animals. And again, I think this is particularly pertinent to our age where there's so much kind of industrial scale farming, and we see animals treated like so much protoplasm that can be manipulated. But I'll just lift up one example. So in chapter 17, there's instructions about how you can eat meat. And it's important to note that in ancient Israel, you don't eat meat every day. Like meat is it's not like 21st century United States or the Western world. You don't eat meat every day. It's kind of a special occasion when you eat meat. And so chapter 17 says, okay, when you do eat meat, here's what you do. So if you kill an animal that is clean, that is eligible for sacrifice, you offer the blood at the sanctuary. You never eat the blood. It says this in Genesis chapter 9. It says this after the flood. It says this several times in Leviticus. Israelites are not to eat the blood of the animal. Why? Because the blood is life. The blood is the essence of the animal's life. And so the blood has to be offered back to the God who gave that animal life to begin with. So that's why I say Leviticus exhibits a profound respect for the life of animals. You don't kill animals senselessly or you do it with intention, you can eat meat, but you do it in a way that is honoring to the God who gave the animal life and that honors the animal itself. And if you don't offer that blood back, then you're guilty of bloodshed or manslaughter.
Well,
So you offer the blood in order to remove the guilt that you incur by killing the animal in the first place. I don't know if that makes sense. And then if you kill a wild animal that can be eaten like a deer, you still don't eat the blood of that. You offer the blood back onto the ground, again, as a sign of respect for the life of the animal that is symbolized by the blood.
so what's weird or interesting about Leviticus? I feel like there's a lot weird. I'm not sure how much interesting, but maybe you can help us with that. I'm just kidding. You've already helped us with that, but yeah.
No, there are some weird things. So let me just, so in chapter 1, right, it's about the burnt offering. I don't know if I made this connection before, but in Exodus, when it talks about the sanctuary, Exodus ends with the sanctuary being built, and then Leviticus begins with, okay, now what do you do, right? What do you do at the sanctuary?
Right.
Chapter 1 begins, the Lord summoned Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when any of you bring an offering of livestock to the Lord, you shall bring your offering from the herd or from the flock. And then it goes into these details. So like the burnt offering shall be flayed and cut up into its parts. Aaron's sons, the priests, shall arrange the parts with the head and the suet on the wood that is on the fire on the altar. But its entrails and its legs shall be washed with water. Then the priest shall turn the whole into smoke on the altar as burnt offering. And then it goes on to, if you're offering something from sheep or goats, it's just on and on with these details that are just weird.
It is.
What do you do with the entrails? What do I do with the fat on the liver? At one point it says the fat, you shall not eat fat because fat is the Lord's. It's just, yeah. And it goes on like that with the skin disease stuff. There's just some details here that are pretty arcane. So kind of weird. But still, again, if you look under the surface, and especially if you have someone helping you, if you're reading a commentary, there's some interesting things here. So there's also a lot of talk about clean and unclean. And that should probably have been on the bingo card as well, but unclean does not necessarily mean sinful. So people become unclean by doing really good things like giving birth, right? Women who give birth are unclean for a while, or preparing a dead body for burial makes you unclean. Sin produces uncleanness, but uncleanness is not necessarily sinful. And so people would probably be in a state of uncleanness most days, actually, just by the kind of ordinary things of ordinary human life. What some scholars like Mary Douglas says is uncleanness seems to be incurred by being in a kind of liminal state. So when you give birth, obviously a lot of women died in childbirth. So that's a kind of liminal state between life and death. So that makes you unclean. Or when you touch a dead body, again, a kind of liminal space between life and death. And so you kind of, or when a woman has her period, again, a kind of liminal state between life and death. So again, kind of weird, but also interesting to think about how that kind of space was treated and what how you became clean again. And clean just meant that you could offer sacrifices at the sanctuary, that you could approach the sanctuary.
Yeah, it didn't have the same kind of moral
lots of weird
valence,
stuff in the Book of
right?
Leviticus.
Like, it doesn't have the same sort of moral
it's not a moral
valence,
valence.
which is one reason why sometimes we really misread, like, the Pharisees in, like, anti-Semitic ways, because they're not, you know what I mean? Like, you're not running around all the time feeling deep, deep shame because you had your period.
No,
or
it's not about
whatever.
shame.
Yeah,
Right.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. It's just, and I'll use this analogy that one of my seminary teachers used, that the sanctuary is kind of like a power plant, right? That if you approach it without being prepared, you're going to get zapped. Right? Not because God is angry with you, but because there's so much power there in the sanctuary. So these rituals and these laws about how to be clean are like, putting on the proper clothing and preparing yourself appropriately to approach the seat of power where God is in the sanctuary. That's why another really weird story in chapter 10 is Aaron's sons offer unholy fire at the sanctuary, and they're zapped.
Right.
they die immediately. And again, we don't know why, except that then a few verses later, God says, don't be drunk when you come to offer sacrifices. The priest should not be drunk when they are doing their priestly duties. So
good advice for all of us.
Maybe, yeah.
Don't be drunk
good
at
advice
church.
For everybody. Yeah.
To the extent
that's
you
right.
can avoid it.
So maybe that's what the unholy fire is. But yeah, I could go on about weird things in the Book of Leviticus. That's probably enough.
It sounds like, contrary to its reputation for being boring, there's actually a lot memorable going on in Leviticus if you just take the time to get into it. Yeah. But are there any, in the rest of Leviticus, are there any memorable verses or chapters we haven't discussed yet that you want to be sure that folks are aware of?
Yeah, I would definitely lift up again the chapter 25, the chapter about Jubilee, because I think that's just such a beautiful vision of a year of homecoming and debts forgiven and slaves set free. And whether or not it was ever practiced, right? That's the question I always get. We don't know if it was ever actually practiced, but it has given rise to movements. Isaiah 61 talks about the year of the Lord's favor. That's the year of Jubilee. And Jesus in Luke 4 talks about, quotes Isaiah 61 and goes back to Leviticus 25, right? The year of the Lord's favor, and says, today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing. So there's this ongoing vision of Jubilee that is of the year of the Lord's favor that's so beautiful. And in the mid-1990s, there was a movement called Jubilee 2000, where Pope John Paul II, and it actually started with some octogenarian Catholic Christians in Britain, who said, let's make the year 2000 a Jubilee. And it was about forgiving the debt of developing countries, of global South countries, so that they could use their money not to pay interest on their debt, but to build roads and hospitals and schools. And billions of dollars was forgiven of international debt in and around the year 2000. So that vision of Jubilee, that movement Jubilee 2000, Bono was part of that too. That vision of Jubilee continues to live on. And I just think that's beautiful. So Leviticus 25, big highlight. I should say this, Leviticus, though neglected, has been used as our gay and lesbian brothers and sisters say, as a clobber text. So there's these famous or infamous verses in chapters 18 and 20 about a man not lying with another man as with a woman, that's an abomination. I don't want to get too much into that, but just to say it's been used in terrible ways for many of our gay and lesbian brothers and sisters. And one would think that those are the only two verses in Leviticus if you were reading only conservative scholars, right? Leviticus also talks about loving your neighbor as yourself and loving the foreigner as yourself. And I think it's not fair to lift up those two verses and ignore everything else. I think one can say that the writers of Leviticus had no conception of sexual orientation or committed faithful same-sex relationships. And we don't really know what was behind these verses. Again, what's the reasoning behind them? But it probably had something to do with the priestly concern for boundaries and for not being like other nations where homosexuality was practiced, we think. But at the same time, I want to say there are Christians for whom that wouldn't agree with what I just said. And I think I want to assert strongly that we as Christians can disagree on things of great importance and still be faithful Christians. I think particularly our Christian brothers and sisters in the global South don't understand why we would interpret these verses in any non-literal way. So that issue of biblical authority and biblical hermeneutics affects not just issues of sexuality, but also things like women's ordination. So it's important to stay in conversation and to model the ability to respectfully disagree about something and not accuse each other of being unfaithful to the gospel. I also want to say this about that, and that's that call to holiness really is about sexual matters as well, right? If you take the Levitical food laws as an analogy, God's call that you shall be holy for I, the Lord your God, am holy, means that we cannot eat every animal that moves. And in this case, we cannot sleep with everyone or everything that moves. What we do with our bodies matters to God. And what we do with our bodies not only matters to God, but also matters for the health of ourselves and our communities. So yeah, I could say more about that. That's probably enough. But those are two verses that obviously are lifted up a lot and misused a lot in Leviticus. But underneath them is this deeper call to holiness, right? That what we do with our bodies matters. What we do with other people's bodies matters. What we do with the land matters. What we do with animals matters to God. I think the left of the church emphasizes, societal sins like racism and sexism, and the right of the church emphasizes personal sins like sexual sins in particular. And God in Leviticus seems to be concerned with both, right? God is concerned with love of the neighbor and with treating the neighbor justly, but God is also concerned with what we do with in our bedrooms, and that we need to be holy in all aspects of our life. So I'm not letting anybody off the hook. And Leviticus isn't letting us off the hook. I'll just mention one other chapter, and that's chapter 19, which comes between those two chapters I mentioned. Chapter 19 is really interesting because here we get one of the great commandments. So when Jesus is asked what is the greatest commandment, he quotes Deuteronomy, love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. That's from Leviticus 19. Leviticus 19 is this whole mishmash of laws. Some really profound, like love your neighbor as yourself. Some like don't mix different kinds of cloth, right, in one garment. And some like don't harvest your field to the very corners, leave it for the widow and the orphan and the foreigner, which we see happening in the book of Ruth. So again, that holiness touches every aspect of life, not just love for the neighbor, but also how we harvest our field and what we do in the marketplace. That holiness should matter to every part of life. I'm going to preach just a minute. Please continue preaching. Maybe.
Hallelujah. Go ahead.
In Leviticus 19, it says not just you shall love your neighbor as yourself, but you shall love the foreigner as yourself, which is, I think, often overlooked. And it breaks my heart and it frustrates me to no end that the same people who use Leviticus against gay and lesbian people don't notice this, right? That we're to love the foreigner as ourselves. So if you're going to use Leviticus, be consistent, right? There's just over and over again this welcome to the stranger and the foreigner as someone to be cherished and someone to be treated with respect and compassion.
Thank you. That was a good word. I think you've touched on a lot of them, but if you could say, what's like one key theme you'd want people to look for as they enter the text?
I'm sounding like a broken record here, but I guess, again, this theme of holiness, that, what does God require of us? And how should we live as a people in relationship with the holy God? Now, a lot of this we can't do, right? We don't have the temple. We don't have the sanctuary, the tabernacle. We don't sacrifice animals because there's no temple. There's no tabernacle. But if we can discern some of the principles behind the laws and the rituals, I think it can help us to discern how God wants us to live, with love for the neighbor, with respect for our bodies and the bodies of others, with respect for the life of animals. These are things, and care for the land. These are things that I think we can look for as we dive under the surface of the book of Leviticus.
And now it's time for your parting shot. This is a complicated book, but describe Leviticus to us in 7 words or less.
I would say something like, called to holiness by our holy God. And again, holiness again, but that's such an overriding theme in Leviticus. And I want to just have a caveat here. I'm not talking here about holier than thou. I think the problem is we take the call to holiness. Lutherans don't talk much about holiness. I'll say that. Mm-hmm. But those of our more evangelical or maybe our Methodist brothers and sisters might be accused of having I won't say Methodist people. Our friend Alan would take
be very upset.
But it's not a holier than thou kind of thing. It's living with integrity so that you're the same person you are, at the football game on Friday night as you are in church on Sunday morning, or as you are in the office on Tuesday afternoon, right? Living as people of God in the best way possible, knowing that we can never achieve holiness on our own. I'll say this is important as the Lutheran theologian. It's the work of the Holy Spirit in us to bring us to cultivate holiness in us. It's not something we can do ourselves, but it's something that the Holy Spirit works in us. And so we don't lord it over others. We don't look down our nose at others. We try to live with integrity as a people called to be set apart by our holy God. I love, there's a Lutheran ethicist named Gilbert Meilander who wrote an article in which he quotes Leviticus, and he ends this article by saying, "You shall be holy is a command, but it is also a promise. You shall be holy." That God will make us people who want to live in God's presence, that God will make us the people that God says we are. You shall be holy. I just think that's such a beautiful way of thinking about it. Certainly it's a command, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. But it's also, for those who have ears to hear, it's also a promise that through the work of the Holy Spirit, God will make us the people that God has created us to be.
I love that.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you to our guest, and who is also a host sometimes, Dr. Kathryn Schifferdecker. And this has been the Bible in a Year podcast from Enter the Bible. And check out more great resources on the Bible at enterthebible.org. Whether you're listening on your favorite podcast app or watching on YouTube, we appreciate you being with us. And you can get more great resources like this: conversations, reflections, commentaries, courses, really anything that you could need as you dive in and enter the Bible with curiosity and faith. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please rate and review or like and subscribe. And of course, the very best compliment you can pay us is to share this podcast with a friend. So until next time,